Everyone, I wanted to introduce you to Courtney.
I cannot believe you did this to me.
Everyone, I'd like you to meet Courtney Hale. She'll be joining us tonight.
I found out my husband had invited his mistress to my 31st birthday dinner exactly 4 minutes before she walked through the door of the restaurant, smiling, wearing a dress the same shade of red as the one hanging in my own closet at home. I found out I was a billionaire exactly 2 days before that. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it took me considerably longer than a second to actually process it myself. The same week my husband, Bryce, was quietly planning the most humiliating night of my adult life. A law firm in New York was trying to reach me about an inheritance from a birth mother I never knew existed. A woman who had built a $2.3 billion retail and logistics empire from nothing, and who had spent the final years of her life searching for the daughter she'd given up for adoption 31 years earlier. I walked into my own birthday dinner that night carrying a secret so massive I could barely hold it steady in my own chest. Bryce walked in carrying a secret of his own, seated 3 tables away, wearing a suit I'd bought him for Christmas, about to introduce his mistress to my closest friends as though I wouldn't notice, or wouldn't care, or wouldn't have anywhere else in the world left to go if I did. He had no idea, sliding into his seat that night with that particular smug confidence men get right before they think they've won something, exactly who he was about to humiliate. Before I tell you what happened next, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button because I promise you this story is worth staying for all the way to the end. Like this video if you're already rooting for me, share it with someone who needs a reminder that karma has better timing than we ever expect. And drop a comment below with the time and the city you're watching from. I read every single one, and I love seeing exactly how far these stories travel. Now let me take you back to the beginning. To the ordinary Tuesday 2 weeks before my birthday when a phone call I almost didn't answer changed absolutely everything. My name is Amara Whitfield, though for the first 31 years of my life, I only ever knew myself as Amara Booker, the name my adoptive parents gave me the day they brought me home from a Philadelphia hospital as a 6-week-old infant. My parents, Gerald and Denise Booker, were the kind of people who built an entire life around steady, unglamorous love. My father worked 31 years as a machinist at a manufacturing plant outside Philadelphia. My mother taught 3rd grade at the same elementary school for almost as long. They couldn't have biological children of their own. And when they adopted me through a private, closed adoption in the early 90s, they never once treated that fact as something to hide or soften. They told me I was adopted as soon as I was old enough to understand the word. And they told me, in the same breath, every single time, that being chosen was its own particular kind of love story. I grew up genuinely happy, genuinely loved, with absolutely no burning need to search for my birth family the way some adopted children eventually do. My adoption had been closed, the record sealed at my birth mother's specific request, and I'd made peace somewhere in my 20s, with never knowing where I biologically came from. I had parents. I had a family. That felt like enough. I met Bryce Whitfield when I was 26, at a mutual friend's engagement party, both of us newly transplanted to Philadelphia's growing finance and consulting scene. He was charming in the specific way that finance guys often are, confident, quick with a joke, the kind of man who made you feel like the most interesting person in any room he walked into. We married 2 years later. I had absolutely no idea, walking down that aisle, exactly how much both halves of my identity were about to be upended within the same single week, 5 years into that marriage. I want to be honest about something, because I think it matters to the rest of this story. I'd noticed things were wrong with Bryce long before that birthday dinner. I just kept finding reasons to explain them away. The same way I think a lot of people do when the alternative feels too painful to fully look at directly. He'd started working later over the past year. Sometimes not coming home until nearly midnight, always with a reasonable explanation about a big account or a demanding client. He'd become more distant during the rare evenings we did spend together, checking his phone constantly, stepping into another room to take calls he used to take right beside me without a second thought. I found a receipt in his coat pocket about 4 months before my birthday, from a restaurant downtown, a Tuesday evening dinner for 2. At a time Bryce had told me he was working late at the office. I asked him about it. He told me it was a client dinner, that the second person on the receipt was a colleague from a competing firm he was trying to poach a deal from. A plausible enough explanation that I let myself believe it, mostly because believing the alternative felt like more than I had the energy to face at the time. I didn't yet know her name. I didn't yet know she worked 3 floors above Bryce's own office, in the same downtown building. A marketing associate named Courtney Hale, who Bryce had been quietly seeing for just over a year by the time my 31st birthday finally arrived. The phone call that changed everything came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks before my birthday, while I was folding laundry and only half paying attention to an unfamiliar New York area code flashing on my screen. I almost let it go to voicemail. I'm still not entirely sure, looking back, what made me pick up instead. "Is this Amara Booker Whitfield?" A woman's voice asked, careful and professional. "My name is Patricia Reyes. I'm an attorney with Sterling and Hoyt, calling on behalf of the estate of Cordelia Ashworth Marsh." I told her, politely, that she must have the wrong number. I had never heard that name in my entire life. "I understand this is going to be a significant shock," Patricia said, her voice gentle but steady, the voice of someone who had clearly delivered news like this before. "Cordelia Ashworth Marsh was your birth mother, Mrs. Whitfield. She passed away 11 days ago. She spent the last 6 years of her life searching for you, through a DNA registry match that was finally confirmed 3 weeks before her death. She left you her entire estate." I sat down on the edge of my bed, laundry basket still balanced on my hip, feeling the floor of my entire understanding of my own life shift beneath me in real time. "Her entire estate," I repeated slowly, still not fully understanding the scale of what Patricia was actually telling me. "Mrs. Whitfield," Patricia said, "your birth mother founded and built Marsh Retail Logistics into one of the largest privately held distribution companies on the East Coast. Her estate, including her controlling ownership stake in the company, is valued at approximately $2.3 billion. All of it, per her explicit final wishes, goes to you." I spent the following week learning about a woman I'd never known existed, piecing together a life story through documents, old interviews, and long conversations with Patricia Reyes that felt, at times, like reading a novel about a stranger rather than absorbing facts about my own biological mother. Cordelia Ashworth Marsh had been 19 years old, unmarried, and functionally alone when she gave birth to me in a Philadelphia hospital, placing me for adoption through a closed, private arrangement because, as her private journals would later reveal, she genuinely believed at 19 that she had absolutely nothing stable enough to offer a child. She built her company from a single regional distribution warehouse over the following decade, working with a relentless, almost punishing drive that Patricia described, carefully, as clearly connected to the daughter she'd given up and spent years believing she didn't deserve to search for. She never married. She never had other children. By the time Cordelia turned 50, Marsh Retail Logistics had become a genuine East Coast powerhouse. And by the time she turned 60, she'd quietly begun searching for me, submitting her own DNA to a private registry, waiting, year after year, for a match that took nearly 6 years to finally surface, right as her own health had begun to fail. She never got to meet me. She died 11 days before Patricia's phone call, just 3 weeks after the DNA match had finally, definitively confirmed I was her daughter. Patricia told me Cordelia had spent those final 3 weeks working with her legal team on a single, focused priority, making absolutely certain that everything she'd built would go entirely irrevocably to me. I read a letter Cordelia had written for me, sealed and dated just 8 days before her death, sitting alone in my kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since my adoptive father's funeral 3 years earlier. Grief for a woman I'd never had the chance to know, layered over something more complicated, a strange, aching gratitude for a sacrifice she'd made at 19 that I was only now, 31 years later, beginning to fully understand. I told exactly no one about the inheritance during that first week. Not my adoptive parents, not my closest friends, and certainly not Bryce, though not for any calculated reason at first. I simply needed time to sit with something this enormous before I could figure out how to say it out loud to anyone else. Bryce, during that same week, was busy planning something of his own, something I had absolutely no idea about until the night it finally happened. I'd asked for a small birthday dinner that year, nothing extravagant, Just 12 of my closest friends and family at a restaurant downtown that Bryce had suggested himself, seeming, at the time, unusually invested in the details of the planning. He picked the venue. He handled the guest list logistics, offering generously to take that task off my plate during what he called a busy week for me at work. I didn't know, accepting that generous offer with genuine gratitude, that Bryce was using his control over that guest list for something far more calculated than simple thoughtfulness. I didn't know he'd added a name to that list that had absolutely no business being anywhere near my 31st birthday dinner. I walked into that restaurant on the night of my birthday carrying the single biggest secret of my entire life. Still processing an inheritance so enormous I could barely hold its full shape in my mind. With absolutely no idea that my own husband was about to hand me a second, entirely different kind of devastating revelation before the night was through. The restaurant was warm, softly lit, exactly the intimate setting I'd asked for. I hugged my closest friends as they arrived, exchanged easy, familiar conversation with my in-laws, felt for the first hour of that dinner, something close to normal for the first time in the strange, overwhelming week I'd just lived through. Then the door opened, and a woman I didn't recognize walked in, scanning the room with a slightly nervous energy before her eyes landed, unmistakably, on Bryce. She was wearing a dress the exact same shade of deep red as one hanging in my own closet at home. A detail so specific, so oddly personal, that I noticed it before I noticed almost anything else about her. Bryce stood up, more quickly than the moment called for, and crossed the room toward her with a familiarity that immediately, viscerally, told me everything I needed to know before a single word was spoken. "Everyone," Bryce said, turning back toward the table, his voice carrying an artificial brightness that made my stomach drop even further. "I want you to meet Courtney. She's been a really important person in my life this past year. And I wanted her to be here to celebrate Amara's birthday with all of us." The table went silent in the exact particular way rooms go silent right before everyone at once understands they're witnessing something they were never supposed to see so clearly. I looked at my husband, standing there with his hand resting, ever so slightly, at the small of Courtney's back, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost eerily calm given everything else churning inside me that week, exactly what he'd done. He hadn't invited Courtney by accident, or out of some misguided sense of honesty. He'd invited her deliberately, publicly, in front of everyone who mattered most to me, because some part of him wanted me humiliated in the most visible, undeniable way he could manage, a small, cruel exclamation point on however long he'd been planning to eventually leave. I sat there for a long moment, feeling every eye at that table swing toward me, waiting, I think, to see exactly how I would react. Whether I'd cry, whether I'd scream, whether I'd give Bryce the exact kind of dramatic, humiliating scene he'd clearly, on some level, been anticipating when he decided to bring her. I didn't give him any of that. Something about the sheer scale of what I'd already absorbed that week. A birth mother I'd never known. A fortune I could barely comprehend. A grief and a gratitude too enormous to fully process in a single sitting. Had left me, strangely, with almost nothing left over for the kind of public devastation Bryce seemed to be expecting. "Courtney," I said instead, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, steady enough that I watched Bryce's confident expression flicker, just slightly with uncertainty. "It's nice to finally put a face to the name. Please sit." We were just about to order appetizers. The table remained tense, uncertain, my closest friends exchanging quick, worried glances, clearly unsure whether my calm was genuine, or the kind of controlled calm that precedes something much bigger. Bryce, for his part, looked almost disappointed by my composure, as though my refusal to fall apart on command had robbed him of something he'd specifically been counting on. I made it through the rest of that dinner with a steadiness that surprised even me, making careful, polite conversation, watching Bryce grow visibly more uncomfortable as the evening wore on without the reaction he'd clearly engineered the entire scene to provoke. I had no idea, sitting there, exactly how much bigger that discomfort was about to become for him within the following week. I left that dinner early, claiming a headache, which wasn't entirely a lie given everything churning behind my calm exterior. I drove home alone, sat in my car in our driveway for nearly 20 minutes before going inside, and made a decision that would define the following several weeks of my life. I decided not to confront Bryce that night. Not out of fear, and not because I needed more time to process what he'd done. That part, honestly, felt almost startlingly clear to me already. I decided to wait because I needed, first, to fully understand my own new reality before I brought Bryce into any part of it, and because some quiet, clear-eyed part of me already understood that the version of this confrontation I wanted to have would land far more powerfully once I fully controlled every piece of information in the room. Bryce came home 2 hours after me, visibly nervous, offering an explanation about Courtney that shifted twice within the same conversation. First claiming she was simply a work friend he'd misjudged the appropriateness of inviting, then, when I remained silent rather than accepting that explanation, admitting, haltingly, that they'd been seeing each other for a few months. A timeline I already suspected, from that earlier receipt, was considerably shorter than the truth. I let him talk. I asked careful, measured questions. I gave him no indication whatsoever of the $2.3 billion inheritance sitting, at that exact moment, in a legal file on Patricia Reyes's desk in New York, waiting for my signature to formally transfer. I wanted Bryce to fully show me exactly who he was, without the influence of what I now had, before I decided exactly what I was going to do about any of it. Over the following 10 days, working quietly with Patricia Reyes and eventually, a family law attorney named Vivian Cho recommended specifically for her experience with high-asset divorce cases, I learned 2 things simultaneously that would completely reshape the rest of my life. I learned the full truth about Bryce's affair, not months as he'd first claimed, but just over a year, confirmed through a private investigator Vivian recommended, who documented a pattern eerily similar to affairs I'd heard about in other stories exactly like this one. Hotel receipts, a consistent Thursday evening pattern, a level of deliberate deception that made the birthday dinner humiliation feel less like an isolated cruel decision, and more like the natural, inevitable endpoint of a year Bryce had already spent quietly building an exit from our marriage. I also learned, working through the formal estate transfer with Patricia, the full scope of exactly what I'd inherited. Not just Cordelia's controlling stake in Marsh Retail Logistics, but a portfolio of real estate holdings, investment accounts, and a private foundation Cordelia had quietly funded for over a decade, supporting adoption services and birth mother support programs across Pennsylvania and New York, a detail that told me more about who my birth mother had truly been than almost anything else in her entire estate. Vivian Cho, reviewing our marital finances during that same period, discovered something Bryce had clearly been counting on me never noticing. He'd been quietly moving money out of our joint accounts for months, building a private fund of his own, presumably to support the new life he was already planning with Courtney, entirely unaware that the wife he was preparing to leave for someone else was about to become one of the wealthiest women on the entire East Coast. I told Bryce everything on a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks after that birthday dinner, sitting across from him at our kitchen table with Vivian Cho's paperwork spread out in front of me. The same careful, methodical approach Cordelia herself, I imagined, might have taken to any major business decision. I know about Courtney, I said. I've known since the dinner, Bryce. I know it's been over a year, not a few months. I know about the money you've been quietly moving into a separate account. And I need you to know something else, before we talk about any of that. I slid Patricia Reyes's estate documentation across the table toward him. 2 weeks before you invited your mistress to my birthday dinner to humiliate me in front of everyone I love, I found out my birth mother died, and left me her entire company. $2.3 billion, Bryce. I sat at that dinner table, watching you parade Courtney in front of my closest friends, already knowing I was about to become one of the wealthiest women in Pennsylvania. And I said absolutely nothing, because I needed to see exactly how far you'd go, and exactly who you really were, before any of this changed anything between us. Bryce stared at the documents, his face moving through several expressions in rapid succession: disbelief, then something that looked uncomfortably like genuine calculation, an expression I watched land on his face and immediately understood everything I needed to know about whatever he might say next. Amara, he finally said, his voice suddenly, transparently different than it had been moments earlier. I think we should talk about this. Really talk. I made a mistake with Courtney, but you and I, we have history. We have a filed petition for divorce, I said, sliding a second document across the table, which Vivian completed on my behalf last week. I'm not here to negotiate reconciliation, Bryce. I'm here to tell you exactly what you lost the night you decided humiliating me in public mattered more than the marriage you claim to still care about. The divorce moved swiftly once the full financial picture became clear, though not, I should say honestly, entirely on my terms. Bryce's attorney attempted, predictably, to argue for a share of assets connected to my newly discovered inheritance. A legal battle Vivian Cho anticipated from the very beginning, and had structured our entire approach specifically to prevent. Because the inheritance had been received entirely after our marital separation began, and because Vivian had moved with careful speed to establish that separation date formally the same week I filed, Pennsylvania law worked firmly in my favor. Bryce received a standard, entirely reasonable division of our actual marital assets built over 5 years of marriage. Nothing connected to Cordelia's estate, not $1 of the fortune he'd had absolutely no idea existed on the night. He chose to humiliate me in front of everyone I loved. Courtney, for her part, ended things with Bryce within a month of the divorce becoming public knowledge. A detail I learned secondhand through mutual friends rather than anything Bryce ever told me directly. I understand, based on those same secondhand accounts, that Bryce has struggled considerably since. Both financially, adjusting to a life without the comfortable assumptions he'd apparently been making about our shared future, and personally, having lost, in a single reckless night, a marriage he perhaps hadn't actually wanted to end so much as he'd wanted to control the terms of its ending. I don't know exactly what Bryce feels, looking back on that birthday dinner now, understanding everything he didn't know in that moment. I've made a conscious choice not to spend much of my own time wondering about it. I formally took over as chairwoman of Marsh Retail Logistics 8 months after that birthday dinner, working closely, during those first months, with the company's existing leadership team to honor exactly the kind of careful, principled growth Cordelia had built the company around for over 3 decades. I expanded her foundation's adoption support work significantly during my first year, adding a program specifically designed to help birth mothers maintain connection with the children they place for adoption, when both parties want that connection. A program I built, in large part, as a direct response to understanding exactly how much Cordelia had wanted, and never gotten, the chance to know her own daughter before it was too late. I reconnected, more deeply than ever before, with my adoptive parents, Gerald and Denise, who received the news of my inheritance with the same steady, grounded love that had defined my entire relationship with them since infancy. My mother cried, hearing about Cordelia's letter, hearing about the years Cordelia had spent quietly searching for me. She gave you to us because she loved you enough to want better for you than she believed she could give at 19. My mother told me. And then she spent the rest of her life trying to find her way back to you anyway. That's not 2 different kinds of love, baby. That's the same love, just showing up in the only way she knew how, at every stage of her life. I think about my birth mother often. A woman I never got to meet, who built an empire out of a sacrifice she made at 19 years old, who spent her final years quietly searching for a daughter she'd never stopped loving. Even from a distance she'd chosen believing it was the right thing to do. I think sometimes about the exact timing of everything. How the same week I learned about a woman who spent her entire life proving her worth without anyone's approval, my own husband tried, deliberately, to make me feel small in front of everyone I loved. I don't think that timing was coincidence exactly. I think it was simply life, delivering its 2 hardest and most clarifying lessons in the same single week, forcing me to understand, all at once, both the astonishing depth of a stranger's sacrifice and the surprisingly shallow depth of a man I'd once promised to spend my entire life beside. I kept the last name Whitfield off my legal paperwork the day the divorce was finalized. I go by Amara Marsh now, honoring the woman who gave me life twice, once at 19, and once again 31 years later, in the exact week I needed it most.
If you're watching this, I'd love to get to know you. Please comment your location and the time below. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for being here today.